Stanley Krippner is a psychologist and parapsychologist, and is a true living legend when it comes to psychical research. In 2002, he received the American Psychological Association's coveted award for his distinguished contribution to the international advancement of psychology. Stanley's written a plethora of books, and has recently completed his memoirs, titled A Chaotic Life. I'm blessed to say that this is my second conversation with Stanley. If you want to watch my first, the link's in the description. Please see the description for timestamps, relevant links, and other interviews that you might enjoy. Thank you so much for doing this with me again, Stanley. I really appreciate you doing that, and I've been looking forward to it for quite a while. Today we're going to jump around and touch on a variety of different topics. So to start us off, I was hoping you could give a quick definition of what is a shaman and what is shamanism.
Well, the term shaman has an interesting history because when the early anthropologists were visiting Siberia, and they found these community icons dressed very strangely and performing very odd rituals, they asked what the individual was called, or group of individuals, and they were called shamans, which translated from the Russian and Siberian has a couple of meanings. One meaning is he who rises, or she who rises, as in journeying of the body experience. And another one is keeper of the sacred, which applies to shamans, certainly.
Yeah.
And so the origin was originally limited to the Siberian shamans, but then other anthropologists found similar icons in other societies, and so they used the term shaman, even though each of the other societies had their own name for that particular community leader.
Yeah.
So my definition of shaman is really three parts. First of all, shamans are socially appointed by a community. Now, this is very important because if somebody comes up to me and says, I'm a shaman, I say, fine, what is your community? And it's not like a lot of professions in the Western world where you get your credentials, make an announcement, and start seeing or healing people. No, that's not the way it works. The community identifies a potential shaman in many ways, depending on the society. Some of them through birthmarks, some of them through dreams, sometimes through an individual recovered from a serious illness, and that gave that person sort of a cachet to start working with other people.
Yeah.
So number one, the shaman is community sanctioned, community identified. Now, point number two, the shaman obtains information in ways that are not available to other members of the community. In other words, the shaman can have a journeying to the upper world, they can journey to the lower world, they can journey to the past, they can journey to the future. Other members of the tribe cannot do this. Once in a while, they do this by accident, but you have to be dependable if you're going to help people. And so shamans, shall we say, at will access this information. How? Look at the letter D. Through dreams, through drugs, through dancing, through dreaming, through drugs, through dancing, to deprivation, where they might go on a long fast.
Okay.
And, of course, there are any number of psychoactive substances that shamans use, but not all shamans take that route.
Yeah.
Some of them have a ritual that they go through. Some of them do what's called lucid dreaming.
Yeah.
Each society has sort of its own way for the shamans to access the information that they need. And then point three, they use this information to help and to heal members of their community and individual members of the community.
Mm-hmm.
So the shaman might be confronted with a member of the tribe who is ailing and sick, and the shaman makes a journey to the world of the spirits, and the spirits might say, yes, there's an herb growing by the riverbank, and that is what your patient needs. Mm. So they go to the riverbank and they harvest the herb, they give it to the patient gets well. Now, maybe this is a placebo effect, or maybe this plant actually had psychoactive properties. Well, doesn't matter as long as the patient recovers.
Yeah.
And you can see that this puts the shaman on the spot. The shaman is in service of the community. And if the shaman's powers fail, or if the shaman gives a wrong prescription, the community might exile the shaman. They might allow the shaman to stay in the community, but take away the shamanic status. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, they might even punish or even kill the shaman. So the shaman's lot is not an easy one.
Yeah. Yeah, no pressure. Wow. Mm-hmm. That's a brilliant breakdown, Stanley. Thank you for that. That's amazing. I've got to pick up on one point you mentioned. You said that one of the ways they might choose or select the shaman is birthmarks. And I'm just wondering what you mean exactly. Is it potentially that the previous shaman dies and then they look for birthmarks matching the person that was the shaman before to kind of hope that this is the same person?
Yes, that's one way to do it. Mm. The older shaman might die, and there might be somebody in the tribe or somebody not yet born who manifests some sort of birthmark that is reminiscent of the late shaman.
Yeah.
However, in some tribes, work that way. If somebody is born albino, with pale skin and white hair, that's the sign that they're very special and can be the shaman. This is interesting because there are other tribes that are terrified by the albinos and they might exile or kill the albino.
Yeah.
Again, each tribe, each culture is a little bit different.
Yeah, they're always humans, I guess.
Oh, good heavens, yes. And of course, there are other like a birthmark, such as a star appearing on the skin, or strange stain that seems to characterize the skin. Mm. These are the types of things that many particular tribes pay special attention to.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that. So I guess to stay kind of in the area of shamans or shamans and shamanism, can you talk about your time with Marina Sabina in Mexico when you visited her? She's a shaman. And I'm wondering kind of what insights did you gain from her when you spent some time with her?
Well, Marina Sabina is probably the most important shaman of the 20th century. Now, her group did not use the word shaman, they used the word sabia, one who knows, in that part of Mexico. And I had read about Marina Sabina in the 1970s, article about her in Life magazine, and Gordon Lawson, a Boston banker, whose hobby was mushrooms, heard that the mushrooms were still being used in Oaxaca, Mexico. And so he and his photographer went to the little town of Huata de Jimenez and asked if they were using the sacred mushrooms. And the people, well, no, we're good Catholics. Those mushrooms are for pagans. We're good Catholics. But then Marina Sabina stepped out of the crowd and said, we do use the mushrooms. And I had a dream last night, and Jesus Christ said, it's time to share this knowledge with the world. So Marina Sabina invited Gordon Wasson and his photographer to a velada, an all-night mushroom ceremony. Mm-hmm. He was very impressed. He had an impression about his son who was in trouble. When he got back to Boston, he found out that the impression was absolutely correct. And so then he brought his wife Valentina to Huata de Jimenez, and they did more work, more photographs, more recordings. I actually have the entire recording that they did of Marina Sabina chanting in her velada. And Marina Sabina was a gifted poet. She'd just chant things spontaneously, talking about herself in metaphor. I'm a clock woman, I'm a wise woman, etc., etc. Remarkable. Yeah. And so when I discussed Marina Sabina with the Mexican psychiatrist Salvador Roquette, who'd been visiting, he said, oh, I know Marina Sabina. And next time I go and visit, I will let you know, and you can come with me. Mm. Well, what a surprise. So we had a little convoy of 2 cars driving these very rough roads. Every now and again, we see a little cross by the roadside, which means somebody had driven off into the valley. Mm. And so we had to be super careful. And we got to Huata de Jimenez and found a small hotel that we could stay in. And of course, Marina Sabina had been informed of our coming, and she was very happy to see Salvador Roquette. And I had a professional photographer with me and asked if we could take her photograph, and she agreed, and she went into her little house and came out dressed in a ceremonial robe, the huipo robe that the shamans in that particular part of Mexico use.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we got wonderful photograph, probably the last professional photographs taken of Marina Sabina. And I had our group give what cash they could, and we gave that to Marina Sabina. Also, it was a cold spell in Mexico, and so I gave her my jacket. She was very pleased. So the next day, we came back for another interview, and Marina Sabina was wearing my jacket. I have a lovely photograph of her little tiny body in my big Western jacket. Nice. And her 2 daughters were drunk out of the gourd. They'd taken the money and had bought beer, and of course we wanted that money to go to Marina Sabina for food and the like. So that was sort of a disappointment.
Yeah.
And Marina Sabina knew that we, members of our group, wanted to have a velada, and she said that she was too old and feeble, and she referred us to one of her students, Dona Clotilda. And Dona Clotilda welcomed us and said, but this is the dry season. I don't have quite enough mushrooms to go around. One of you will have to abstain. And I said, well, I have had the mushroom experience. It was great. I'll be happy to abstain. Oh, good, she said, you can be my assistant. So, being her assistant, I learned probably much more than I would have learned taking the mushroom.
Yeah.
The floor was covered with pine boughs. I later found out why, because people would vomit into the pine boughs and the scent would sort of be dissipated.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Marina Sabina gave me some candles to put on the concrete floor. And she held a candle above the floor and the wax dripped on the floor, and then she put the candle in. I tried it. I had to do it 3 or 4 times. And then I noticed the difference. Dona Catilda's candles were all straight on the bottom, very easy to put into the wax.
Yeah.
The candles she gave me were very rough on the bottom. Took me a long time. And I thought, well, this is very clever. It shows how superior she is to this visiting gringo.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing that I learned. This is one way in which shamans really enhance their reputation by making themselves look good. Well, they have to. This is for the benefit of the tribe, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And so then Dona Catilda would send me off to help some people who are having a rough time, especially the people who just spoke English, because Dona Catilda did not speak Spanish. I know enough Spanish to get by, but other people, for the most part, didn't. So she sent me to work with 2 people. One was a Mexican concert pianist who had stage fright, to perform. One was a former Miss Kentucky who had depended on her beauty for most of her life. And now the beauty was fading and she had an identity crisis. She was sort of empty inside.
Yeah. Now,
they were both patients of Salvador Roquette. And that's why he brought them along, as well as others, to the mushroom velada, thinking that they would obtain great insight, and indeed they did. So the concert pianist, I had visualized his entrance onto the stage, not with no stage fright, but just a tiny bit of stage fright to enhance his performance.
Mm-hmm.
So he went through this visualization several times. And I'm happy to say several weeks later, I found out he was back on the concert stage.
Yeah.
And then the former Miss Kentucky, I said, if somebody were to describe the best traits that you have, what would they say? Oh, and she would say, well, compassion and kindness, and I'm a good cook, and I don't have children myself, but I'm happy to be with children. I said, well, there you are. So that's the base of your identity. Yeah. And you can go on with there. Both of them were so happy and delighted. They were kissing me, one on one cheek, one on the other cheek. Ordinarily, this would have been a pleasure, but they were both reeking with vomit, and I could hardly breathe with all vomit fumes facing me. So, as you can see, I learned a great deal by being Dona Catilda's assistant. Yeah. And then the next morning, Salvador Roquette came, and then he did group therapy with all of them to sort of integrate what they had experienced in the mushroom velada. And so, obviously, I have written about my meeting with Marina Sabina several times. And I should add one thing. Some of the conservative people in the town were very, very angry at Marina Sabina because outsiders were now coming and trying to find her. And they said, well, she's really broken all of our rules. We have to kill her. No, she's so old, she'll die anyway. We'll just kill her son. So they killed her teenage son.
Oh, really?
Nobody was ever arrested. They couldn't find the murderer. It was probably a group of people. And Marina Sabina had sadness on her face for the rest of her life. The photographs that we took of her they all show sadness, even though she is very regally posed for a photographer. So that's the story.
Wow. That's awful about her son, but I mean, wow, apart from that, it's an incredible story. Unbelievable. Let's move from Mexico to Brazil then, and talk about some of your ayahuasca experiences with, I think, indigenous churches in Brazil. Is that right?
Oh, good heavens, yes.
So was this before or after the Mexico trip? When was this approximately?
Much later.
Much later. Okay.
The use of ayahuasca in Brazil and other places goes back centuries.
Mm.
And it's really quite amazing because ayahuasca, which is a mind-altering tea, is made basically from two different plants. Mm. And you have to have just the right proportion of each plant to produce the psychedelic effect.
Yeah.
So, hundreds of years ago, how did the indigenous tribes ever figure out that combination?
Mm.
And I asked some of them about this. Oh, well, the plants told us. Well, that's as good an answer as anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had ayahuasca 10 times, 8 times in Brazil, 2 times in the island of Hawaii. And yes, I've had very singular experiences. I never had anything unpleasant. Not that that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I was also able to guide some people through the experience who had never taken it before. But as you might know, there are 3, what can we say, ayahuasca churches in Brazil, and the 3 of them do differ in slightly different ways.
Okay.
One is the União de Vegetal, which is the meeting of the vegetables. One is the Santo Daime, that give me health. And Ayahuasca, which is a very robust group, and one of my students actually did his dissertation on it, but I have not had the chance to drink ayahuasca with that group. Yes.
Okay.
So back to my experiences.
Yeah.
I took a group from the Institute of Pneumatic Sciences to Brazil, and the first time somebody offered ayahuasca, and some of our group volunteered to participate, and I could not participate because I felt it was my responsibility to go with the other group. Mm-hmm. A year later, I took a different group to Brazil, and this time everybody wanted to take ayahuasca. So we were in a fairly large temple outside of Rio de Janeiro, and we were segregated, men on one side, women on the other side. I have to say, parenthetically, the ayahuasca churches in Brazil are somewhat sexist, so I don't certainly go along with everything that they purport to believe.
Yeah.
So I was with the men after drinking ayahuasca, and I could see what was happening with the women. There was one member of our group who was very, very religiously conservative.
Right.
And at first she didn't want to take the ayahuasca at all because she thought it might be the work of the devil.
Yeah.
And then she decided to take it. And of course she had a bad trip.
Oh, yeah.
And the people who were with her, the Americans, said, oh, let's take her outside. She needs the fresh air. And the Brazilians were saying, no, we know what to do. We know how to handle it. And as usual, the Americans think that they know everything. And so they took the poor woman outside, and she actually got worse. And I was viewing all of this at a distance. And of course, I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't cross the line.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it was a very remarkable trip. The member of our group sitting next to me felt that he was turning into a beautiful jade stone. And so he just sat for several hours as a jade stone and enjoyed the jade tone experience. Never can tell what's going to happen with ayahuasca.
Yeah.
So I mentioned 2 ayahuasca trips on the Big Island of Hawaii, where they actually have a branch of Santo Daime, and they've been supervised by shamans from Brazil to know that they're doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. And that particular church is actually going strong to this day. And of course, as we conduct this interview, there's a disaster on the nearby island of Maui with over 100 people dead, forest fires, homes destroyed. And yes, the Santo Daime group is doing some things to come to their assistance. So there certainly are charitable aspects to the ayahuasca churches also.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. The guy that was
I was recently at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver. Some 14,000 people came to the conference. It was incredible.
Wow. And
there were several presentations on ayahuasca, which I was happy to see.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's there's probably going to be more research on that, as we progress, right? And especially, I don't know if you're aware, but Aaron Rodgers, the NFL quarterback, he very famous NFL quarterback, he famously tried this recently, I think a year or two ago, and spoke about it in some interviews. So I think it gained a lot more awareness, a lot more popularity, and got people talking about it. And so I think, yeah, that reached a lot more people. I imagine a lot more people will want to try it. What would you say to somebody that does want to try it? Would you advise it? Would you say be careful? Any advice?
I am not a good person to ask for advice, because I think that the answer is actually within the person rather than outside of the person. And I have had many people over the years ask if I would advise them to take ayahuasca, and I should be happy to discuss my experience. And of course, you realize that the results are unpredictable.
Yeah.
But if you make the decision, make sure that you are doing it with a group that knows what they're doing and with a substance that is the real thing.
Yeah.
It comes down to the 3 S's when you have a psychedelic experience: the substance, the set, and the setting. You have to have good ayahuasca that's the real thing, made out of, boiling these 2 plants in just the right combination. You have to have the right setting, the environment in which you're taking the ayahuasca, which hopefully is a somewhat natural setting with a lot of nature inside or outside.
Yeah.
And then third, the set. Are you ready for the experience? Are you taking a positive point of view about the experience with no hesitation? So if all 3 of the S's are conducive, then the person who asked me the question is better prepared. But like I say, ultimately, I can't make the decision for them.
No, but that is still good advice. I'll give you that.
I'm happy to say that the people who I've talked to throughout the years who've asked me the question, they all had very good experiences.
Yeah. And you said you haven't had a bad experience. What was your most, you don't have to tell the story in detail, but what was your most maybe interesting experience on ayahuasca? Because obviously you said the guy near you had the jade stone experience. So what was your kind of most memorable one? If you kind of remember, just in brief. Again, no detail required, really.
Well, one of them was in Brazil. This was the Santo Daime ceremony.
Yeah.
And I was with a group of people for whom this was the first time. And the ayahuasca itself was very well prepared, very, very strong. And I had this fantasy of being in a garden in which there are several tents.
Mm-hmm.
And each tent was inhabited by a beautiful goddess. And I was going from tent to tent, making love with each of the goddesses.
Wow.
One of the goddesses was Aphrodite from the Greek tradition.
Yeah.
One of them was Urzule from the Voodoo tradition in Haiti. One of them was Venus from the Roman tradition.
Yeah.
There was even an Asian goddess. So my trip from tent to tent was interrupted, not once but twice. A member of our group who was getting sick, and so I had to help him go and find a place in the bushes where he could throw up. And I assured him, you'll still have a chance for a positive experience because now you know that the ayahuasca has gotten into your system. So I put a positive spin on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the guys was vomiting into a little pail, and I said, look at how the vomit is swirling around, making a little design. It's like the whole universe of the world is in your vomit. And he said, the whole universe of the world is in my vomit. So, yeah, wow. So I had, like I say, to go back and forth from my trip to the folks who were having a little hard time.
Yeah.
But that was a very lovely setting, by the way. And they actually had some ayahuasca musicians playing Icaros. These are the chants and the songs that supposedly are given by the spirits. And there's a whole litany of very beautiful Icaros from various parts of Brazil. I hope somebody records them sometimes. This is a very outstanding set of anthropological songs.
Yeah. Wow.
So the bottom line, of course, in all of this is, why do you take them in the first place? And I encourage people to ask themselves the question to make sure that they have the focus. That is part of the set, the SET.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they have a personal problem that they want to help. Sometimes they might be grieving the loss of a loved one that they want help for. Sometimes they simply want the ayahuasca experience. And then I say, if that's your goal, tell that to the ayahuasca spirits. Mm-hmm. And so they'll be sure to honor you and teach you something. So yes, I think that it's important for the set that people are oriented to what they really want to get out of that particular experience.
Yeah, an objective. Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Stanley. Let's move on and talk a little bit about somebody that you used to know, the famous, the late magician, James Randi, who is obviously famous for having this $1 million prize that he allegedly would have offered to somebody that was able to convince him or prove to him the reality of psychic phenomena. So can you just talk a little bit about James, about your relationship with him, and kind of why you think nobody ever collected the money?
Well, his $1 million prize got a lot of publicity.
Yeah.
And people constantly ask me, why don't some of the psychics you know try to claim the prize? Well, for one thing, I know somebody who did try to claim the prize, and there are so many conditions placed on it, what had to be done, how it needed to be repeated, that it just was overwhelming for them to jump through all of the hoops. Now, of course, for $1 million prize, you have to have certain assurances that what you're seeing is the real thing.
Yeah.
So I can understand that point of view. But then from the psychic's point of view, this is not the way things work. You cannot come up with a parapsychological demonstration on demand. There are so many conditions that have to be met. And it's no surprise to me that very, very few people volunteered, and then with all of the conditions in place, they felt that they did not perform as well as they should have. Well, the psychic in Brazil that I was working with, Amir Ahmadin, wanted to claim the prize. He said, well, I'll be happy to perform naked for Randi. This is a psychic in Brazil that's associated with a number of apports that I've written about, objects that seemingly fall out of no place.
Yeah.
Well, we could never raise the money to bring Amir and a family member to the United States. It was a shame. And now both Amir and Randi are gone, so maybe in another universe they're getting together and demonstrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the $1 million prize, good publicity for Randi, very bad publicity for the psychic world.
Yeah.
But again, the disconnection here is that psychic feats are rarely available on demand. Now, the shamans had to perform psychic feats constantly, and they couldn't always depend upon their ability. So they often used sleight of hand, or they often attributed a healing to something else. And so in the world of shamanism, you would never see this question asked or answered in quite the same way.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to Randi. My interactions with him have all been pleasant, and Randi is well known for going off the deep end and making an exaggeration or making a statement that's not true. And I caught him on that 3 times. And this was in the days before email. And he sent me an email back saying, yes, he agreed. And so rather than criticizing him from afar, I confronted him personally.
Yeah.
And I think that gave him a great deal of respect for me, because I also gave him some praise. He wrote a book about Nostradamus, the alleged seer and predictor of world events, that I thought was brilliant, the way that he underscored the Nostradamus predictions that allegedly did come true, and found no, there's really nothing of substance there. So years later, the local newspaper in San Francisco did a big interview of me. And then they said, well, we have to find somebody who will say something negative about you. And I said, yes, go ahead. And so one of the people they contacted was Randi. And you can look this up in print. It's quite astounding. He said, and Randi said, well, you know, in this world of so many claims and so many counterclaims, you could always depend on Stan Krippner to be unbiased. Yeah. He's not prejudiced one way or another at all. Well, of course, Randi was right, but I was delighted to see him say this in print.
Yeah.
Yes, so I kept in touch with Randi about from one thing or another till he passed on.
Yeah. Do you think ultimately that the prize was, you know, was it disingenuous? Did he ever have any intention of awarding it? Do you think he could have been convinced, or was it one of those things that it was just kind of never going to happen?
It was a good publicity stunt. That's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, yeah. Because as you said, with all the requirements, and from my understanding, he also turned some people away, or, you know, there were various different things going on. Mm-hmm. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. You were involved in the making of the well-known film, The Exorcist, I understand. I didn't realize this before, but I recently learned about that. So what was your role in that, and how did that come about?
Well, you mentioned my memoirs about a bit earlier.
Yeah, and I've got another couple of questions about them after as well, if that's okay.
But I was at my office in the Dream Laboratory in Brooklyn, New York, one afternoon, and I stayed after everybody else had left. I had some things to do, and it's a good thing I stayed, because there was a knock on the door, and who should walk in but William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist.
Yeah.
And he don't know who I am, but my name is William Friedkin, and I'm a Hollywood director. Of course I know who you are. I saw The French Connection, brilliant film. So that got us off to a good start.
Yeah. And
he told me that he had the rights to The Exorcist and wanted my advice on how to turn it into a movie. Mm. Well, good heavens, great compliment.
Yeah.
So I said, Mr. Friedkin, I think there are two possibilities. One possibility would be to make a movie like the Japanese movie Rashomon, where a murder victim and his death are viewed by four different people with four different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And I said, for The Exorcist, you could have it seen from the eyes of the mother, of the daughter who was possessed, of the priest who tried to do the exorcism, and from the demons themselves. Mm. This would go, you'd get rave reviews, would go over very well in the arts circles. Wouldn't do so well at the box office because it does not have a neat conclusion. The other possibility is to film it exactly the way it was in the book, highlighting all of the melodrama that's in the book, and it might not get top critical reads, but it'll make a fortune.
Yeah.
And so he thanked me and was on his way. Oh, he also said, I want to cast a real young girl who's psychic for the role. And I said, well, I have somebody in mind. Her name is Tammy Cohen, and I will put you in touch with her. And sure enough, the very next day he visited Tammy Cohen, who was just out of high school, and her mother, Judith Sketch-Whitson. And he described the movie. Judy had read the book. After they're going to film it just the way it's in the book. He said, yes, just the way. Including the scene where the young girl masturbates with a cross. He says, oh, yes, that too. I want my daughter to be in any such movie.
Yeah.
So that was the end of that. And the daughter didn't speak to her mother for weeks, but that's the way it goes. And of course, he got Linda Brer, who did an excellent job as the young girl. Wonderful job. Actually, I saw her on stage in one of her stage roles.
Yeah.
So a while later, William Friedkin was at a party with a friend of mine. And my friend said, Mr. Friedkin, do you remember your conversation with Stanley Krippner in Brooklyn, New York? Oh, good heavens, yes. I never could have made the movie the way I did without that Krippner's advice.
Wow.
He's probably being overly generous, but it makes a good story.
Yeah, and it's nice to hear for you, right? That's nice to hear that. And
now, of course, the exorcism is in the news because the authoritative sequel is being filmed, and there have been any number of sequels in the past, none of them of very high artistic quality. But let's see what this new one brings to the screen.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's a good moment to ask you for your thoughts, kind of in brief, on real life alleged possessions and exorcisms. Like, what do you make of those phenomena?
It's a very complicated question because each so-called possession is a little bit different.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Roman Catholic Church actually has increased the number of priests who are trained to do exorcisms.
Right.
So rather than exorcism being a thing of the past, no, exorcisms are alive and well today. And the help rate of exorcisms really needs to be tabulated. I don't think this has ever been done. So who might have passed judgment on the exorcism one way or the other? The Roman Catholics are not the only ones that do exorcism, by the way.
Yeah.
And I actually saw an exorcism in Brazil in an Umbanda ritual. This is one of the African Brazilian religions where this poor frail woman believed that she was being possessed by demonic forces, and Pai Li, the shaman in charge, did a ritual. Now this is without ayahuasca. A ritual in this poor woman's face got distorted, and Pai Li told me that was the devil inside her. And he invited the demon to come into his own body. And as the demon was about to hit Pai Li's body, he constructed a shield, and the demon was sent off into his own realm.
Yeah.
And it seemed to work quite well. The young woman felt relieved, back to her old self. And the reason so much of this is complicated is that we all within our psyches have a number of subpersonalities. And sometimes they come out in surprising ways, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. But sometimes those subpersonalities coalesce and form an identity of their own. And in the case of multiple identity disorder, what used to be called multiple personalities, they take control of the person, and if they are doing harm, they are candidates for psychotherapy. So now psychotherapy within that world has taken the place of exorcism, and the multiple personality folks do have a way of getting help because of some fairly recent advances in psychotherapy. I knew probably the most famous dissociative identity disorder patient for the last several decades. There was Chris Sizemore, who is the Eve in the three faces of Eve. And what the authors didn't tell the readers is that the third face was not the final face. Chris had several more identity disorders. When the movie The Three Faces of Eve was playing in Atlanta, the authors of the book were there. Chris Sizemore was not invited. She was in a nearby hotel waiting for somebody to pick her up. Nobody came. And she almost killed herself. She felt that she had let them down by developing yet another face, the fourth face of Eve.
Oh, wow.
Ultimately, there are 21 different faces. And then the psychiatrist really knew what he was doing and did some intensive therapy that got everything integrated.
Yeah.
Chris told me that she had a dream, and all of her past identities were walking on the stage, and they all said goodbye.
Wow.
She said goodbye to them, never had a problem again.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, that is really amazing. That's something. I find that whole phenomena of kind of possessions and multiple personalities really intriguing me, and it's really, really interesting. Especially, there's cases, aren't there, where like the multiple personalities, they have different tastes or phobias, and they maybe allergies, or various things that are actually on the physical side, which is, it's just crazy. But
well,
yeah,
you're
wow.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
In Chris Sizemore cases, one of her identities needed distance glasses, one needed local sight glasses.
Yeah.
And she was allergic to some foods and would break out, and another identity would eat the food with gusto. And so there are actually physiological changes that occur in a lot of these dissociative identity disorder cases.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It speaks volumes about the mind-body relationship. So you mentioned kind of your memoirs. We mentioned your memoirs. So you've recently finished writing those. It's titled A Chaotic Life. It's going to be released in October 2023. When did you start writing your memoirs, and how did you come up with the name A Chaotic Life?
Well, a little over 2 years ago, I was approached by a publisher, Park Street Press, that wanted me to write something autobiographical.
Yeah.
Because they knew about my work in transpersonal psychology and my contact with Abraham Maslow, Anthony Sutich, and other leaders in the transpersonal field. And
so you knew Maslow, you knew him personally.
Oh, well, yes, I just finished writing a chapter on Maslow for a book.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. I learned about Maslow in school when I studied psychology. And
wonderful.
The hierarchy of needs.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, carry on. That's incredible that you met Abraham Maslow.
Well, I started writing, and then I needed some information from a friend of mine, and so I sent him 2 chapters and asked him to check them over after. And he said, I'm a reader for University Professors Press, and we want this book.
Yeah.
And, well, you'll have to negotiate with Park Street Press. And I was sort of flattered that 2 people wanted it.
Yeah.
And I don't know how the negotiations went, but University Professors Press came up with the contract, and I had 2 years, and I just made it at the end of July with the final edits. And so now it's off to the publisher. Who knows when it'll be published?
Yeah.
Hopefully before the end of the year, we will see.
Yeah, I think the plan is October, right? I think 2023 October. I think that's the hope.
Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I look forward to seeing it. And yeah, the title, was that you that came up with that, A Chaotic Life, or was somebody suggesting it? Or
there were several titles, but as I started to write, I realized how very small events in my life had a chain reaction
Yeah. Okay.
that produced a major change in my life.
Yeah.
And this is the premise of chaos theory, one of the premises. A shift in initial conditions can produce what's called the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
As if the flapping of a butterfly's wings in Kansas could trigger a cyclone in Japan. This, of course, is a metaphor, but you get the point. It's called the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
And so each of my 50 chapters starts out with an incident from my life, and then I trace the way that that incident developed over the years and indeed over the decades.
Yeah.
Whether it be with my interest in parapsychology or hypnosis or psychedelics or trauma, any of the other things I'm interested in, yeah, they all had sort of a very specific beginning, and they unraveled and unwound in a way that I never could have anticipated.
Amazing.
Like with Marina Sabina.
Yeah.
I read the article about her in Life magazine. Never in a million years did I ever think that I would actually meet her and photograph her.
And give her your jacket and everything. Yeah, amazing. It makes me think of a Steve Jobs quote where I think he said that you can't ever connect the dots looking forward, only when you're looking back. So I guess that's what you've been doing the last 2 years, is looking back and connecting the dots and saying, oh yeah, that was, that led me to that, and that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for that. And yeah, wow, that's amazing. I can't wait to read it.
So you are so right. Connecting the dots is a good metaphor. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I connected dots in a way that I had not thought of before.
Yeah. And so we just mentioned Abraham Maslow. Which other historical figures and or historical events feature in your memoirs?
Oh, good heavens. Well, I suppose that I would have to mention Alan Watts, who was a great influence on my life.
Yeah.
And we developed a very lovely friendship over the years. And also some of the leaders of humanistic psychology, like Raoul May and Carl Rogers. And then I had very long-standing relationship with Albert Ellis, who was the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy. Another lovely relationship with Laura Huxley, the wife of Aldous Huxley. And I actually was invited to her 90th birthday party, which was just incredible.
Yeah. And
Ram Dass, the former Richard Alpert, was there, and he had suffered a stroke. And so when he was making some comments, when he lacked the words, Al Huang, who was a Tai Chi master, danced the rest of the sentence for him.
Wow.
That was quite an amazing performance.
Yeah.
And I had a chance to talk to Ram Dass, and he paid me a nice compliment. He said, when I first met you, were all in your head. Now I can see that you've opened up your heart. What a lovely compliment for him.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I knew Timothy Leary and other people in that psychedelic scene. And I would have to I'm trying to think of people in other fields. Yes, Daniel Ellsberg is a good friend of mine.
Wow, yeah.
And he, of course, leaked the Pentagon Papers to the press, almost went to jail, but helped to end the Vietnam War. And once the brouhaha was over and Nixon resigned and the United States finally got out of Vietnam, they wanted him to write a book about his ordeal. And he said, I've never written a book. And one of his friends said, talk to Stanley Krippner. He's written more books than anybody I know.
Yeah.
And so I met with Dan Ellsberg. The advice that he'd gotten in the past was not useful. People wanted them to do an outline, do bullet points. No. They're making you start the wrong way. Start specific. Come up with one specific incident and write that up. And then to understand that incident, you have to give your readers other incidents. And so instead of going from the top to the bottom, go from the bottom to the top. Well, it seemed to work.
Yeah.
On my 70th birthday party, he was one of the guests, and people were asked to share a reminiscence of me. And he said, well, I always appreciated Stan's advice that helped me to write about my ordeal. I don't think I could have done it without his help. Well, of course, the group was shocked. I had only confided this to one or two people, but it certainly was a very great honor, because early on, I could see the folly of the Vietnam War, and I did my bit. I was in the first anti-war march in New York City, but more specifically, I got a dozen young men out of the draft by writing letters on Maimonides Medical Center stationery that they were not fit for service. And when they came to ask me for the letter, I said, well, you can say that you are a drug addict. You can say that you're gay. You can say that you're a sociopath and might end up killing your commanding officer, or all three. You take your choice, and I'll tell you how to present yourself to the draft board.
Yeah.
Especially funny when some of them pretended to be gay, and they used all the stereotypical characteristics that worked. All 12 of them got out of the draft. Wow. And so that was my major contribution to ending the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Saved a few lives. Saved a
definitely.
few people from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, saved a few, and you changed a lot of lives throughout yours as well, that's for sure. I wonder how many. I don't know if we'll ever have a number. If I asked you, like, if nothing comes to mind, no problem for this. I just wonder if there's one, of your most meaningful experiences or accomplishments, either an experience or an accomplishment that comes, like, what would come to mind if I said, what's your most meaningful experience or accomplishment that people will learn about in your memoirs? Is there something that comes straight to mind? Or
oh, good heavens, yes. In retrospect, I'm really amazed at the work that I did for 10 years at the Maimonides Medical Center Dream Laboratory. Mm-hmm. And our book on the subject by Monty Ullman and myself, Dream Telepathy, just came out in the 50th year anniversary.
Yeah.
So, still making waves. And none of the criticisms of that work really hold up.
Yeah.
And the meta-analysis that was done with all of the Dream ESP experiments found holes in many of the experiments, but not in the ones we did with Maimonides. So I knew very, very little about dreams when I started, but I did have a good background in psychology, and so I did a quick learn. And also, to design the experiments was a challenge, to make it absolutely impossible that the dreamer could have knowledge of the target picture in any other way but ESP.
Yeah.
And so one of the experiments was a precognitive dream experiment that I took a special care with. I made sure the people running the machinery, the EEG, knew nothing about the experiment. They just came in and did their job and then left.
Mm-hmm.
And made sure that there was no way that the dreamer could know about the picture that would be chosen by random once he woke up. So, yes, I'm very happy with those 10 years.
Yeah.
And then, surprisingly enough, I spent 4 years as program director of summer YMCA camps in Wisconsin and Virginia. And looking back at that, I did things that I had virtually no experience on doing. Living in an outdoor environment, well, I'd done that with Boy Scouts. I enjoyed camping. But here I was in a supervisory position, and that meant taking care of the health and welfare of the campers, protecting them from natural or unnatural disasters and ensuring that they would have a good time, planning special programs. I really, in retrospect, myself, and I even went out camping with some of the older campers, and I can remember going to a setting which was a deep pond and a tree where people could go and jump into the pond.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody had jumped into the pond and had cut his feet so badly on the broken glass, he had to be taken back and sent to the hospital. And somebody said to me, "Stan, I think you can do that without getting hurt." I said, "Of course I can." Had no idea what would happen. I climbed up to the top of the tree, jumped in the pot, and I lifted my feet up so they would not touch the bottom. And I swam to shore. So the fact that I had mastered that jumping test became part of my reputation.
Yeah.
Yes. And also, I took a great liking to the rifle range, and I had never fired a rifle before. And I actually I was so good of a marksman, I got up to marksman first class, which is the National Rifle Association scale of awards. I still have some of the targets where you can see all the bullets in the bullet hole, the bullseye hole, and nothing else. So that knowledge helped me in yet another way. On one of my big visits to Mickey Hart's ranch, Mickey Hart of the Grateful Dead, he had just purchased a new rifle and wanted to take it to the rifle range.
Yeah.
So I went along as he and Bob Weir, Bill Kreisman were trying out the new rifle. And then sort of gratuitously said, "Stan, would you like to give it a try?" He had no idea that I would accept it. "Yes, I'll give it a try." And so I got the rifle in place. My first shot was an exact bullseye. Nobody else had gotten the bullseye. So I rested on my laurels.
Yeah. 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 That's awesome. I didn't assume that you were going to be, an expert rifleman, but wow, you got more strings to your bow than I thought, Stanley. It's impressive. Are you okay for just two more questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. First one is a very quick one. You can kind of just spill out whatever first comes to mind. And I'm just wondering, other than your plethora, your impressive plethora of books, which people should check out and browse through, but apart from those, which books or book would you recommend that I and others listening and watching read that are in the areas of parapsychology, consciousness, and these kind of things?
There are so many books on the market.
Yeah.
That it's very hard.
And I know you've read hundreds of them and hundreds.
Well, of course, it depends on the reader, but first of all, to mention one of my own books, the book I co-edited called Varieties of Anomalous Experience is a very good introduction to parapsychological experiences, near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, past life experiences, lucid dream experiences.
So it's cover all, really.
Yes, yeah. All of those.
Wow.
Presenting the evidence for their existence and their interpretation. And that was published by the American Psychological Association, not too shabby. And they published the second edition because the first edition did so well. Now, American Psychological Association just published a book called Death is an Altered State of Consciousness. And this is a very scholarly, well-written book covering the evidence for life after death.
Cool.
And the author thinks the evidence points conclusively to life after death.
Yeah.
Not as the major religions describe it, but as people who've had out-of-body experiences and death experiences describe it.
Yeah.
And yes, that book is extremely well written. I think that, good heavens, there are so many worthwhile introductory books to these topics.
Yeah, no pressure to pick any more if you're struggling, because I know there's so many and you've read so many. So
I'm
no
telling
pressure.
you, I'm surprised. I thought everything that needed to be said about parapsychology had already been said. No, there are new books coming out all the time.
Yeah.
And I just hope the publishers are happy with the sales. And in terms of books that are negative, I know some books in the past I would recommend. Can't think of anything right in the future to recommend.
Yeah.
But as you know, the Bigelow Foundation sponsored a contest on essays providing the best proof for life after death. And they spent $1.5 million giving awards to the writers. I'm waiting for the other side to present their point of view.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a challenge, and the critics have been so vociferous in the past, and I'm just wondering what will happen. I subscribe to a magazine called The Skeptical Inquirer, which I agree with most of the time, except when it comes to parapsychology. Well, I know that they will publish something on it, but I have yet to see them come out with it. Well, time will tell.
Yeah, time will tell indeed.
By the way, all of the prize-winning essays are at the Bigelow Institute for Conscious Studies website, so people can read them free of charge.
Treasure trove right there. I'll put the link in the description for that. I mean, there's so many, aren't there, as well, that got an honorable mention that are available to download. Yeah, it's brilliant. Look, last question I'll ask for you today, Stanley, just before I ask for some final words. We talked last time, actually, when we spoke last time, we did talk about UFOs a little bit. So I just wanted to get your kind of not your thoughts in general, but your thoughts on the latest goings on. If you've been keeping up with it, if you've been keeping up with David Grush, the whistleblower that's come forward, the congressional hearings and this kind of stuff, are you aware of that? And what are your thoughts on the progression of this topic?
Oh, good heavens, yes, I'm very aware of that. And I've been following that the best I can. I think that the evidence is slowly occurring. And talk about complications. This is a complicated phenomenon. Jacques Vallée, who's probably the outstanding scholar on identified flying objects or unidentified aerial phenomena, if you prefer, has been following the trail for decades. And he thinks the explanation might actually involve other dimensions, other universes. But he does feel that the phenomena are real.
Yeah.
I was with Jacques Vallée recently in Houston, Texas, for the dedication of the archives of the impossible. Those archives now have all of my published works, Rice University, and also Jacques Vallée's published work, and also the notes that he's taken over the years.
Wow.
What a rich archive that will be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and so I had one experience that I wrote up with a group in Brazil. We were a little country inn and have been talking about UFOs. And I said, no, I've never seen a UFO. I think they're avoiding me. And we went to bed, and I got a phone call. Stan, come outside. There's a UFO in the sky. So I ran out in my slippers, climbed up this hill, tearing the slippers to shreds, by the way. But there was up in the sky, a globe with various colors flashing on and off. And nobody had a camera, unfortunately, but it was so far distant, I don't think it would have helped. And then slowly it dissipated.
Yeah.
So I said, well, what could this have been? It couldn't have been an optical. It couldn't have been. It couldn't have been a astrological event, because it didn't look like an eclipse or a shooting star or anything like that. It couldn't be that people were lying, because we all got to see it.
Mm-hmm.
We tried to figure out all the possible explanations, and none of them worked. So years later, I was asked to write up this experience, and they did some research on it. There are numerous UFO sightings in Brazil, but on that particular night, nothing was reported. However, on that particular night, students in a nearby university had created a floating balloon and had sent it into the sky. So that floating balloon is what we saw and attributed to being a UFO.
Yeah. And I do know that you had another experience as well, that what you didn't see anything, but two people you were with saw something. And if people want to hear about that, they should go and listen to my first conversation with you, where we talked about that, and we talked about UFOs in a little bit more detail.
Well, yes, the other experience was also in Brazil.
Yeah, don't worry about having to go into it now if you don't want to, Stanley, because again, we spoke about it last time, and if people want to hear it, they can go over there and find it. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Just the last thing on David Grush and his claims that the US government they're working on craft of non-human origin. They're trying to reverse engineer, and he even has claimed that they have bodies, non-human bodies. What do you think of those extraordinary claims?
Oh, I've heard those reports literally for decades.
Yeah.
And all I can say, I'm following the reports with great interest.
Yeah.
And we'll see what comes of it. At least there's some action going on right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
More action than I think we've seen on this topic for a long time.
At least things are moving, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I feel the same way about parapsychological research. Obviously, in a massive way, thanks to your work and your career and your life, it's moving forward towards the post-materialist world. Thankfully, thanks to your input. So, Stanley, I've taken up enough of your time today. I'm so grateful for everything, really, for your work, for your time, for your conversation, for you sharing your experiences. You're a true legend in this field. Lastly, before I let you go, have you got any kind of final thoughts? Last time I asked you for words of wisdom and you said you're not really very wise, but I beg to disagree. So have you got any words of wisdom or just parting words for people that have watched and listened?
Well, for a final thought, I would reiterate what Aldous Huxley said many years ago when he was asked that question. And he said, I would suggest that people be a little more kind to each other. And I can't think of any better advice to that. People need to be kind to themselves and also kind to others.
Yeah.
That's a good
that'll do.
way I take to close our remarks.
Yeah, that would change the world right there. If everybody was a bit kinder and a bit nicer to one another, that would change the world overnight. So again, thank you so much, Stanley. I'm indebted to you. I really appreciate you, and I wish you all my very best, okay?
Sure enough, okay.
Thank you to Stanley Krippner for talking with me again. Thank you for listening, and a huge thank you to our patrons for giving us hope and making this possible. Please see the description for links and more. If you want to unravel the universe with us, please subscribe. And if you want to help us continue to make content, please consider a small monthly contribution via Patreon. Thank you.